When you hear the name Babylon, what scene comes to mind? Greed, pride, corruption, and a city that ultimately collapsed. In the Bible, it is an image of judgment, a name that seems to hold all the arrogance of civilization in one place. That is how many people remember Babylon. But let me ask you a question. Was Babylon really a city of pure evil? Surprisingly, the Babylon of actual history had a completely different face from the one we imagine. Built on the banks of the Euphrates, this was once one of the most magnificent, most powerful, and most highly organized megacities in the world. So why is it that we remember this overwhelming center of civilization in such dark terms? And there is another question that is even more fascinating. That city, for all its strength and splendor, eventually fell. But did it really fall because it became too luxurious, too arrogant? The truth, surprisingly, is far more complicated. There was something inside the city more dangerous than its walls. Today, we are going to follow those two questions. First, what kind of place Babylon really was, and why it came to be remembered in two radically different ways. Second, how and why that dazzling empire finally collapsed. And in the end, what we will discover is this: the evil shaped by memory and the truth spoken by history are not always the same. And the moment we begin to understand that gap, Babylon stops being just a legend and starts to appear again as a living history that still speaks to us now. So then, let's begin this rediscovery of Babylon. The first misunderstanding we need to break is this: Babylon was not originally some decaying, decadent city on the verge of collapse. In fact, it was the exact opposite. It was one of the most glorious and powerful cities in all of ancient Mesopotamia. Located on the Euphrates, Babylon was a vast center where commerce, administration, religion, and culture all came together. And in the Neo-Babylonian period, the city once again began to dream of becoming the center of the world. What set that revival in motion? The decline of the Assyrian Empire. For a long time, Babylon had been tossed around between great powers. But in the late 7th century BCE, Nabopolassar laid the foundations for independence, and the entire game began to change. Then, under his successor, Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon finally reached its peak. Can you imagine what Babylon looked like at that time? Its walls were strengthened. The city itself was meticulously reorganized. Its grand processional way stretched through the capital, and the Ishtar Gate, famous for its brilliant decoration, became a symbol of imperial majesty. People looking at this city probably did not simply think, "This place is rich." They likely felt, "The center of the world is here." So this is the first thing we need to remember. Babylon was not a dying city of decadence. It was once a megacity of overwhelming administrative power, economic strength, architectural brilliance, and political imagination. But then why do we remember Babylon in such dark colors? This is where one of the most important scenes enters the story: the fall of the kingdom of Judah and the Babylonian exile. Nebuchadnezzar II conquered Jerusalem and took many Jews into Babylon. To people who had lost their nation, their temple, and their homeland, Babylon could never have been just another great city. Psalm 137 captures that pain exactly. It says that by the rivers of Babylon they sat and wept when they remembered Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? Surrounded by magnificent palaces and towering walls, they could not laugh, and they could not sing. For them, Babylon was the place of defeat, the space of loss, and a land of spiritual testing that they had to endure with their whole being. What is interesting, though, is that even in the middle of that land of exile, some remained faithful. In the book of Daniel, Daniel and his friends are portrayed living inside the royal court of Babylon, refusing to bow to idols and holding fast to their God. Men who faced the lion's den and the blazing furnace without surrender were right there in the heart of that city. So for the Jews, Babylon was not only a land of despair, it was also a place marked by the stories of those who endured the test of faith. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. A place that was a glorious capital to some was the place where another person's life fell apart. The same city, the same walls, the same river, but a completely different face, depending on who was standing inside it. That is why, if we want to understand Babylon properly, we have to distinguish between two things: Babylon as it really was, and Babylon as it was remembered. Those are not always the same. The real Babylon was far more complex. It was the capital of a massive empire, a city through which international trade flowed, a place where religious authority was concentrated, and a center where countless peoples and languages mixed together. In some records, it appears as the most magnificent city in the world. In others, it appears as the concentrated symbol of human pride. It is hard to say that either picture is completely wrong, but if we hold on to only one of them, we move farther and farther away from the truth. Take one example. The moment people hear Babylon, they think of the Hanging Gardens. They are so famous that it feels natural to assume they stood in the center of the city. But surprisingly, that has never been definitively proven. Some scholars even suggest that the gardens may actually have been in Nineveh. In other words, Babylon is also a city where history and legend have become deeply entangled. The image of the Tower of Babel is similar. People think of human arrogance reaching toward heaven. But the story in Genesis is set in this same region, in the land of Shinar. And, historically speaking, Babylon really did have a massive ziggurat. It is entirely possible that these monumental religious structures later merged with symbolic tradition to create an even stronger and more overwhelming image. In the end, Babylon became both a real city and a symbolic one. And at some point, many people began to remember the symbolic Babylon more strongly than the historical one. Now let's move to the second question. Why did such a glorious Babylon fall? We tend to like simple endings. We like the idea that it became corrupt and was punished overnight. It is dramatic, clean, and morally satisfying. And in fact, the Bible presents exactly that kind of powerful scene. In Daniel chapter 5, King Belshazzar holds a great feast. At the very moment he is drinking wine from the gold and silver vessels taken from the temple, a hand suddenly appears and writes mysterious words on the wall. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Daniel interprets the message like this: God has already numbered the days of this kingdom, weighed it on the scales, and found it wanting. And that very night, Belshazzar dies, and the kingdom falls. You can see why that scene became such a powerful image. A luxurious banquet, power indulging itself, and judgment arriving in an instant. This is the original form of the image that comes to mind whenever we think of Babylon. But actual history is a little more complicated than that dramatic scene. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon began to weaken politically. The succession to the throne was unstable, and in the final period, Nabonidus spent long stretches of time away from the capital, fueling internal dissatisfaction. Religious tensions were added to the mix, and support from the ruling class and the priesthood steadily eroded. And it was exactly into that gap that Cyrus II of Persia moved. In 539 BCE, Babylon finally fell to Persia. Later stories say that the Persians diverted the waters of the Euphrates and entered the city through the riverbed. But contemporary sources suggest that Babylon may have been taken with far less resistance than we usually imagine. What is especially interesting is that this conqueror, Cyrus, also appears in the Bible. In the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is named in advance and described as an instrument who would help restore Jerusalem. And in fact, after Persia conquered Babylon, the Jews were given the opportunity to return home. So from the biblical perspective, the fall of Babylon was not simply the end of judgment. At the same time, for someone else, it was the beginning of restoration and return. What does that mean? It means Babylon did not simply collapse because it became too luxurious. Its downfall is much closer to a combination of geopolitical pressure, internal fractures, and failures in the exercise of power. But the reason the name Babylon became even more complex is that its collapse could be read as judgment by some and as liberation by others. And there is an insight here for us. Strong cities do not endure by walls alone. No matter how glorious a society looks on the outside, if trust inside begins to break down, no empire can stand for long. And no city, no civilization, no empire can be reduced to a single sentence. They are always more complicated than that. So whenever I think about Babylon, I find myself asking this. What we should really fear is not the great city itself, but the habit of believing that only one memory is the truth. Babylon was certainly, for some, a symbol of oppression, but at the same time, for others, it was a city of wonder, the very center of civilization and power. We have to hold both of those faces together if we want to move even a little closer to history. But the Bible goes one step further. In the book of Revelation, Babylon becomes more than an actual city. It reappears as the symbolic name for all worldly powers and corruption that stand against God. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. That declaration is no longer just about an ancient city conquered by Persia. It becomes the language of judgment, repeated across the ages. And what is fascinating is that Revelation does not end the story of that fall in despair. After Babylon falls, what comes next is the vision of a new heaven and a new earth, and of a new city where God dwells with his people. In other words, the larger biblical picture is this. The splendid and prideful cities built by human hands will one day fall. But after that fall, what remains is not judgment alone. Restoration and new hope are already being prepared. The people who sat and wept by the river in the Psalms, and the people like Daniel, who kept their faith in the furnace of Babylon, eventually lived to see the day when they returned home. The collapse was not the end. There was restoration afterward. That may be the message the Bible keeps speaking to us through the name Babylon. So the next time you hear the name Babylon, try to remember it like this. It was not simply a symbol of evil, nor simply a story of judgment. It was a name marked by both collapse and restoration. Human pride will surely fall, but on the ruins of that fall, God always raises new hope. And once you begin to see it that way, Babylon stops being just the name of an ancient city. It begins to appear again as a living message that still speaks to us now, wherever we may be standing today, reminding us to remember the story of restoration, prepared beyond the collapse.